There is nothing impossible to him who will try.
Hey everyone. In today's video, I would like to walk with you in the footsteps of one of the greatest conquerors of all times, Alexander the Great. This is the topic you chose, at least the majority of you, in the last survey I organized. So I hope you're going to like it. And as always, when I organize a survey, there's going to be a version of this same video in French and in Spanish. To help me bring the character back to life, I have another special guest today who you just heard at the beginning. His name is WhispersRedASMR, and he started to make ASMR videos just a few months ago. But I think they're really worth checking out, so I invited him to participate in this video and in the French version too, and I'm glad he accepted. So thank you to him, and I hope that maybe for some of you this is going to be an opportunity to discover his work. He makes videos in English, in French and in German too. You will find a link to his channel in the description below. But it's now time for our little trip to the past to begin. So I invite you to relax, to put your headsets on, as we travel back in time to the 4th century before Christ, in 356, when Alexander was born.
I am not afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep. I am afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion.
Alexander was the son of Philip II, king of Macedon or Macedonia, an ancient kingdom located in the north of what is Greece today. But back then, the world seen by the Greeks was very different and also smaller than the world we know today. They knew fairly well about the coasts of the Mediterranean Sea. They knew Egypt, North Africa, parts of Western Europe. East, they knew large parts of the Middle East that they called Asia, and beyond the limits of the Greek world, all the non-Greeks were called barbarians, a word that defined everything that was non-Greek and supposedly not civilized or less civilized than the Greeks. The heart of the classic Greek culture and civilization was in the south of Greece, a relatively small piece of land where you found very famous cities such as Athens, Sparta, Thebes or Olympia, and others. And the Greek world was politically fragmented. These cities had a sense of belonging to the same people, the same culture and civilization, but they were politically independent from one another and often at war. Macedon belonged to the Greek world and was strongly influenced by Greece culturally, but being a bit far from the heart of Greek culture, it was considered half Greek, half barbarian by people from Athens or Sparta that considered themselves the true keepers of Greek civilization. In the 4th century before Christ, the Greeks had already explored towards the west, founded colonies around the Mediterranean Sea, established trade routes with other peoples. But for decades already, since the 5th century before Christ, the biggest threat to the independence of Greek cities had been the expansion of the biggest, the most powerful empire of that time, the Persian or Achaemenid Empire. Starting from a small region around their capital, Persepolis, the Persians had extended their empire in every direction towards India, towards Central Asia, towards the Arabic Peninsula, Anatolia, which corresponds to Turkey today. They had also conquered Egypt, and it seemed that nothing could stop the expansion of this empire that was considerably more populated, wealthier, and with much bigger armies than the Greeks. During Alexander's childhood, his father, Philip II, considerably expands the frontiers and power of Macedon, conquering more territories towards the west, the east, the north, and going to war with Greek cities with the dream to unify them behind him so that the Greeks would be able to attack the Persians. We know little about Alexander's childhood. There has been so many myths, legends added to his history that it is difficult to know what is true and what was invented during or after his life. But what we know is that he received a very good education, and not only to become a general, he had a very famous private teacher, Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. He knew very well all the basics of Greek culture, including literature and myth, such as the Iliad, as told by Homer, the story of the War of Troy. He was also raised in the belief that his family had heroic or divine origins. Zeus, the king of God, through his father, and Achilles, one of the most famous heroes of the War of Troy, through his mother. We don't really know to what extent people from the royal family believed in these stories. Maybe they just spread it for propaganda, but it might have helped him gain confidence in his destiny.
How great are the dangers I face to win a good name in Athens.
Relatively soon, when Alexander is still a teenager, his father Philip II starts to prepare him for his future role as a king. He is associated with power. He receives a military command in some of the battles his father is fighting against Greek cities to force them to unify. For example, in 338 before Christ, when he is just 18 years old, he participates in a battle against the city of Thebes, one of the wars in which Macedon was involved, because Philip II wanted to force the unity of all Greek cities, and he contributes to the victory. But when he is only 20 years old, in 336, Philip II is assassinated, and Alexander becomes the new king of Macedon. He inherits from his father an almost unified Greek world, but not without inner tensions. Some of the cities that had been forced to participate in this union under Macedon try to revolt, and in particular the city of Thebes. So one of the first things Alexander is going to do is reinforce his authority and impose his rule to Greek cities. The army of Thebes is defeated, and Alexander orders the complete destruction of the city. Once he has more or less pacified the kingdom of Macedon and the rest of the Greek world, he is now ready to keep walking in the footsteps of his father and go to war with the Persians. In 334, as he is just 22 years old, he lands on the coast of Anatolia, what is Turkey today, near the site where the ancient city of Troy was supposedly built. His army has about 40,000 men, cavalry and infantry included. This is almost nothing in comparison with the armies of the Persian Empire. But despite this numerical inferiority, this is the beginning of a 10 years epic, during which he is going to conquer one of the largest empires in history and travel 10,000 kilometers, almost 7,000 miles, discover new land, found cities, and become the greatest conqueror of the antiquity.
Heaven cannot brook two sons, nor earth two masters.
As soon as Alexander attacks the Persian Empire, the Persians react and gather their armies in Anatolia to march against him. The first battle takes place between the Macedonian army and a slightly bigger Persian army. This is the Battle of Granicus, one of the most important battles in Alexander's epic, and the first of his victories against the Persians. He manages to disband the enemy army, and in the following month to liberate the Greek cities from the coast of Anatolia that had been occupied by the Persians. He is now ready to continue the invasion, and he is going to march through Anatolia, moving inland to continue his invasion. He now decides to march south towards Egypt, but on the way to Egypt he faces again another Persian army, and this time the Persians have had time to prepare the counterattack, and the army they gather is incomparably bigger than the Macedonians, and this is maybe one of the two most famous victories of Alexander, the Battle of Issus. In the Battle of Issus that took place in what is Syria today, the Macedonian army faces a much bigger Persian army. The numbers are uncertain, but at least the Persians were 4 to 5 times more numerous than the Greeks. But thanks to his military genius, a better positioning, the use of speed, and the optimization of his forces, Alexander the Great manages to defeat the Persians and force the Emperor of Persia, Darius III, to abandon the battlefield. In his escape, Darius III is forced to abandon his family, his mother, his wife, his daughters, and a considerable treasure that the Greeks managed to capture. The Battle of Granicus had been an unfortunate defeat for the Persians, but not such a severe one. They had had no time to gather all their forces, but after the Battle of Issus, it appears that the Macedonian army and Alexander become a deadly threat for the Persians, as he has humiliated the emperor, captured his family, and disbanded a much bigger army. Short term, this opens the road to other parts of the Middle East, and Alexander continues his journey continuing to conquer and annex more territories. His next stop is going to be Egypt, and given that the Egyptians reject the Persians that they see as occupiers, his conquest of Egypt is going to be exceptionally fast and relatively easy.
I would rather excel others in the knowledge of what is excellent than in the extent of my powers and dominion.
In 331 before Christ, Alexander is now 25, and his invasion has started just 3 years before, but he now controls the entire Mediterranean coast of the Middle East and Egypt. He has gained considerable prestige, driving out the Persians and their official representative in the province of Egypt, the satrap. The satraps in the Persian Empire were the representatives of the emperor in each province. And using this prestige, he's going to be proclaimed Pharaoh of Egypt the same year, in 331 before Christ. During his stay in Egypt, he also founds the city of Alexandria, which is just one of the numerous cities bearing his name he will found during his conquest. We know little about his physical appearance. What we know is that he had eyes of different colors. He also probably looked fairly athletic, given that he had been engaged in wars, battles, and had been training since his early years. He was surrounded by a group of friends of the same generation, his generals, and he had a particularly close friend, another Macedonian noble called Hephaestion. They had grown up together, and the nature of their relationship remains uncertain. We don't know if it was just a very strong friendship or if they were lovers too. There is no direct evidence of that, but we know that when Hephaestion died, a few months before Alexander, a few years later, Alexander was devastated, and it may have even contributed to the decline in his health. However, in ancient Greece, bisexuality or even homosexuality was not a problem and was not frowned much upon by most of the population, as long as it respected certain codes, and in the case of a prince, as long as he would got married and have heirs to the throne. Alexander would get married twice a few years later and have at least 2 children. Despite the conquest of Anatolia, Syria, Palestine and Egypt, and his victory at Issus, Alexander has just conquered a fraction of the Persian Empire, and the Persian threat has not been eradicated. In fact, the Emperor Darius III has found a refuge in the city of Babylon, closer to the heart of his empire, and started to rebuild an army in order to reconquer the lost territories. Once again, and even though the Persian army remains considerably bigger than his, Alexander decides to go on the offensive, and in the spring of 331 before Christ, he leaves Egypt and marches east towards Mesopotamia, towards Babylon, to face Darius' new army. In October of the same year, he meets Darius again at the Battle of Gaugamela in the north of Iraq.
Our enemies are Medes and Persians, men who for centuries have lived soft and luxurious lives. We of Macedon, for generations past, have been trained in in the hard school of danger and war.
At the Battle of Gaugamela, the Persians have had time to prepare the battlefield. They rely on their numerical superiority. Alexander's army has about 40,000 to 50,000 soldiers, including the cavalry and the infantry, whereas the Persians are probably around 300,000. These numbers are considerable, and this is one of the largest battles in the antiquity. Just to give you an idea, about 1,500 years later, during the Middle Age in Western Europe, large battles involved 10,000, maybe 15,000 soldiers, both sides included. And in the Western world, it's only 2,000 years later, with the Napoleonic Wars, that armies of more than 100,000 men would reappear on the battlefields. Once again, thanks to his military capabilities and personal courage too, because Alexander leads the armies and participates in the battle himself, contrary to Darius that remains behind his army. He wins a decisive victory at Gaugamela, and for the Persian Empire, this is the beginning of the end. Darius has to escape again towards the mountains of Iran, of Persia, where he's going to be assassinated shortly after. Alexander becomes king of Asia, Asia as defined by the Greeks, as I said at the beginning. But the following 2 years are going to be a bit more difficult for his armies. He needs to pacify Persia, and this is going to take 2 years, from 330 to 328 before Christ. As he did in Egypt and in the other provinces he conquered before, Alexander and his army respect local customs, beliefs, religions, and they just replace the Persian administration with their representatives. Alexander also increases the size of his army by recruiting soldiers in Persia and in the regions he conquers. So bit by bit, his army becomes less Macedonian or less Greek and more international. He launches a campaign towards Central Asia, a region called Bactrian, and this is where he finds his first wife, a princess called Roxana. It seems that this was a marriage out of love, more than for political reasons, and he will have a son from Roxana. But in 328 before Christ, his territories are now pacified and he wants to continue his conquest, this time trying to invade the northwest of India. And this is going to be the last of his campaigns. He enters India in 327. Even though his victories are less brilliant than Issus or Gaugamela, he is victorious again and takes control of the region of Punjab. But finally his army, exhausted by these years of fighting, by the Indian monsoon, which is hard to stand for Greek soldiers, refuses to march further. Alexander is now 30. He rules over an empire that spreads from the Adriatic Sea, close to Italy, to the northwest of India, from Egypt to Central Asia, probably the largest empire that ever existed back then, even larger than the Persian Empire before he started to invade it. His prestige is now enormous. He is worshipped as a god from Egypt to Persia, and already considered a legend. After such an epic conquest, as he looks invincible and at the height of his power, Alexander's death looks almost absurd. At least it's going to remind everyone that he's not a god. In 323, he falls sick. We don't exactly know which disease, a fever, apparently. And after 10 days, he dies in Babylon, at more or less the geographical center of his empire. This giant empire he has conquered is not going to survive much longer. It is immediately shared between his generals. This is how a Greek dynasty starts to rule over Egypt. I told you about that in the video about the life of Cleopatra. But all the other provinces also receive a Greek ruler, a Greek king. Some of these dynasties will last a few decades, other centuries. And the inheritage of Alexander's conquest is gigantic and much more important than the shortness of his life could let us think. He has spread the Greek, the Hellenic culture, much beyond the historical frontiers of Greece. This is going to strongly influence the Mediterranean world, the Middle East, even parts of Asia. Alexander remains a legend, almost a mythical character in various cultural traditions. He appears in the Bible, in the Quran, and all future conquerors, Caesar, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, will be compared with him. As always, there would be so much more to say, but this was just intended to be an introduction. So I leave you here for this time, but I hope you appreciated this moment. I would like to thank again WhispersRedASMR for his contribution, and I encourage you to check his channel. I will shortly upload the French and Spanish versions of this same video, and I hope I see you soon for a new one. Au revoir.